Frances went back inside and began the day's first task, measuring dark blue worsted for Mrs. Alderton, hands and mind working separately. The unfamiliar woman reappeared at the top of the street an hour later, walking now in the opposite direction, more slowly this time. She had apparently gone to the marketplace and was returning, and she walked now with the pace of someone choosing to look rather than move. Once she stopped entirely and stood for a full minute looking up at a carved wooden beam on the house directly opposite. The beam had been carved in the 16th century with an intertwined foliage pattern worn now to a beautiful gray-brown smoothness. She looked at the beam the way Frances looked at things, not a glance, but a real look prepared to stay as long as needed. Frances found this interesting in the quiet, precise way she found most things interesting, without urgency and without the need to act immediately. Her name, Frances learned 3 days later from Mrs. Blackwood, was Dorothea Marsh, and she had come from London entirely alone. She had taken the rooms above the old printer's shop on Church Street, vacant since the spring, arriving with one trunk and many books. The books had apparently required a second delivery from the carrier's cart, and had filled the shelves and required the purchase of additional shelving. "Schoolteacher," said Mrs. Blackwood with the decisive tone of a woman delivering a verdict she considered beyond any reasonable dispute or question. "Or headmistress, they say, from London," and she said London in the particular tone that Suffolk people reserved for that distant and foreign city. "She comes down for bread every morning at 7, walks the long way round Church Street, round the Priory, back through the marketplace." "Good morning," Frances said, and continued measuring the flannel because Mrs. Thorpe was waiting and the work required her full and careful attention. Dorothea came in and closed the door behind her and began quietly and without fuss to look at the wool on the shelves carefully. She bought a skein of dark blue wool, choosing it herself, standing at the shelves for several minutes with focused and unhurried deliberation. Frances watched her choose with the peripheral attention she brought to everything that happened within the shop during any given working hour. Dorothea's hands, when she took the skein from the shelf and held it up to examine the color, were steady and considered hands. They were the hands of someone who had worked, not physically, but in the way that constant use of the mind and will produces its own marking. She held the wool as she had looked at the carved beam on Water Street, with the quality of attention that is prepared to take its time. "This one," she said, and brought it to the counter, and Frances wrapped it and told her the price, and Dorothea paid without comment. She put the wool in her bag, and she looked at Frances again with the same direct, unhurried look she had given everything else today. "You are Mrs. Holt," she said, and it was not quite a question, but more like the careful confirmation of something already almost known. "I am," Frances said, and waited in the particular way she waited, with presence and without expectation and without the need to fill the air. "I am Dorothea Marsh," she said. "I have taken the rooms on Church Street, and I wanted to introduce myself to you properly today." Frances looked at her, really looked in the way she looked at things, and found what she usually found when she looked carefully at people. The plane tree at the corner, the church bell, the frost on the cobblestones, the smell of wood smoke, the low amber light on the pink plaster walls. And through this December, something new had entered the familiar pattern. A figure in a gray coat walking at 7:15 toward the baker's shop. A second cup on the shelf in the back room. A book left on the counter. A look exchanged in the churchyard over old illegible stones in the frost. The loom grew its cloth thread by careful thread through the Sunday afternoons, and the village kept its patient and unbroken promise to the season. And Francis Holt sat in the reading chair by the fire in the long evenings and wrote in the 18th notebook what she had seen and understood. The witness works both ways. She wrote one February evening when the snowdrops had appeared at the priory wall, as they appeared there every year. I have been the witness, and I have received the witness, and the circuit is complete, and the world has kept its quiet and sufficient promise once again. She closed the notebook and looked at the fire and thought about the 2 cups on the shelf and the green cloth beginning on the loom. And she thought that this, all of this, the village in the winter and the careful friendship made of attention and silence and dark blue wool, was enough. It was in fact everything, and the bell would count the morning hour, and the morning would come, and the world would continue as it had always continued. Almost entirely paid for by 2 families because they could and because they wanted to, and she said it as though this fact still astonished her considerably. "That is what my mother always said," Francis replied. "They could have built a smaller one, and they chose the large one because they wanted to." "Why?" Dorothea asked, and Francis thought about this, not performing thought, but actually thinking, letting the question settle before offering an answer to it. "Because they understood that the building would outlast them," Francis said, "that the size of it would still be there when they themselves were gone and forgotten. It would be there when everyone had forgotten their names," she continued, "and the building would remain as evidence that something very large had been felt. Even if the person who felt it was no longer there to describe it or confirm it or explain it to anyone who might ask about it later." Dorothea looked at her with the look of someone encountering an idea that has arrived at exactly the moment when it was most needed and most ready. "Yes," she said, "that is exactly it." And again the exactness seemed to matter, the precision of the meeting between the thought and the words that held it. She bought the ochre wool, and she left the book on the counter, by accident or what appeared to be accident, and Francis put it carefully aside. She returned it to Dorothea the following Monday, and both of them understood in the returning that the leaving had not been entirely accidental at all. December came to Lavenham with its dry, still cold coming off the flat fields, concentrating itself in the alleys and the low spots of the cobblestone lanes. Francis had lived through 61 December mornings and walked into each one finding what she always found, the village at its most essential and clear. Her pace had slowed, Francis had noticed, from the pace of her first days in the village, not dramatically, but perceptibly to a careful observer's eye. The cold had clearly arrived at Dorothea as well. She had added a dark wool scarf to the gray coat and walked leaning slightly forward into the air. She will get used to it, Francis thought, and then immediately thought, she is getting used to it already, which was a different and more accurate observation. On the 24th of November, a Saturday, Dorothea came into the shop in the mid-afternoon, carrying in addition to her bag a large cloth-bound book. She set it on the counter while she looked at the wool and Francis looked at the book, A History of Suffolk Wool Towns from a Cambridge press. The spine was worn, the pages slightly splayed. It had been read, and not for the first time, which the book showed clearly in every detail. "You have been researching," Francis said, and Dorothea looked up and said, "I have been reading," with the distinction of someone for whom the difference mattered. "Research has an aim," she said. "Reading goes where it goes," and Francis understood from this that Dorothea was allowing herself to be led somewhere new. "And where did it go?" Francis asked, and Dorothea's fingers rested on a skein of deep ochre wool while she considered how to answer accurately. "It went to the weavers," Dorothea said, "the 15th century weavers who built this village, the families, the money they made, and what they chose to do with it. They built the church," she said, with the tone of someone who has found something genuinely surprising in what they had been quietly reading about. "The plaster of the houses receiving it and returning it in the amber range, giving the whole street a warmth that feels almost domestic. Mrs. Blackwood reports new arrival on Church Street. Former headmistress from London, has been in the shop once and bought dark blue wool. Chose it carefully, took her time, her hands when she held the skein steady and considered, the hands of someone accustomed to making careful decisions. Her manner guarded but not unkind. There is something in her of the quality of a room that has been closed for some time and is opening. The air not yet fully exchanged, the temperature not yet quite itself, but the process clearly and unmistakably underway and moving in its proper direction." She closed the notebook and looked at the fire for some time, thinking about what she had written and whether it was sufficiently accurate. She decided it was approximately accurate, which was the best she usually hoped for when writing about things that were still in the process of becoming. Dorothea Marsh came into the shop on the 12th of November, and then again on the 15th, and then again on the 19th of the month. She did not always buy something. On the 15th she came in, looked at the new delivery of green wool, said the green is very fine, and left. On the 19th she bought 3 skeins of gray and stood at the counter while Francis wrapped them and asked without looking up from the wool. "How long have you been here?" she asked, not intrusively, but in the tone of someone whose curiosity has become quiet enough to be asked directly. "All my life," Francis said. "I was born in this house," which was true and which she had never felt any need to apologize for or explain. "And the shop?" Dorothea asked. "My grandfather's, then my mother's, then mine," Francis said, and the continuity of it felt right and solid as she said it. A great deal more than the surface presented, more than the dark gray coat and the careful diction and the steady, deliberate hands showed. Dorothea Marsh was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour of the day or the length of any particular journey. She was guarded in a way that had become so habitual that she was probably no longer aware of it as a thing she was doing. And underneath both the tiredness and the guardedness, there was something else that Francis did not yet have a name for, but recognized. The kind of thing that brought people to small Suffolk villages in late autumn with one trunk and a very great many books to unpack. "How do you find the rooms?" Francis asked, in the tone of someone genuinely interested in the answer and prepared to hear whatever was given. "Cold," Dorothea said, "but good bones," and Francis found that she was almost smiling at the precision and the aptness of that answer. She did not keep a diary in any conventional sense. She did not record moods or opinions or events in any kind of sequential narrative form. What the notebooks contained was something closer to what a naturalist might record: observations of the world as it presented itself each day, entered with the care and precision of someone who understood that the things most worth preserving were the ones too small and quiet to survive otherwise. On the evening of the 9th of November, she sat in the reading chair by the sitting room fire and opened the notebook to a new page. "November," she wrote. "The village has settled into its winter self with the usual quiet efficiency that this particular season always brings. The plane tree on the marketplace has lost all but a dozen leaves, and by the week's end they will certainly be entirely gone from it. The light this afternoon at 4 had the particular quality it achieves in mid-November, warmer than it should be given the actual temperature." Mrs. Blackwood opened her bedroom window at 6:30 every morning regardless of the temperature, a habit of many decades' duration. The village had come to regard this small ritual as a kind of clock, more reliable than most mechanical instruments available nearby. The kettle sang and Francis made her tea and took it to the Windsor chair beside the kitchen window and sat down slowly. The chair was worn to the color and texture of old bone and had been in this position for as long as she remembered. She held the cup in both hands and let the warmth come through her palms and looked at the garden in the darkness. This too was a ritual: the sitting, the holding, the looking, the listening, the slow and patient receiving of the morning as it came. At 8 o'clock she opened the shutters of the shop and looked out at Water Street in the low gray November light. The familiar curve of the street, the timber-framed houses opposite, the cobblestones dark and damp with the overnight moisture, all exactly right. The bare branches of the laburnum in the garden 3 doors north reached over the wall into the street with easy, unconcerned authority. A woman was walking up the street whom Francis did not recognize and had never seen in all her 61 Lavenham years. She was perhaps 58 years old, tall, carrying herself with the compressed posture of someone accustomed to long years of authority. Her coat was good quality dark gray wool, the kind that suggested London rather than Suffolk, well made and carefully maintained. She carried a single leather bag over her left shoulder and walked with the deliberate step of someone navigating unfamiliar geography carefully. She did not look into the shop as she passed, and Francis watched her go with a mild and patient and unhurried curiosity. Not the sharp curiosity that needed immediate satisfaction, but the slower kind that understood most things revealed themselves in time if given space. She went to the window and looked at Water Street and watched one of the plane tree's last leaves detach and fall slowly turning in the still air. In the third week of November, the weather changed in the way that Suffolk weather changes, without drama, without announcement, simply arriving more fully itself. The temperature dropped below freezing for the first time overnight on the 21st, and the cobblestones were pale and glittering in the early morning. Frances stood in the shop doorway in her coat and breathed the cold air and looked at the street and thought, simply and clearly, winter. The plane tree at the corner had lost its last leaves overnight, and the branches were entirely bare, reaching against the pale sky with perfect clarity. She had always found the November branches of familiar trees more legible than those same branches in leaf, their actual structure finally visible and clear. She had been thinking about Dorothea in the way she thought about things she found interesting, not deliberately, but in the background of other thoughts. The way a tune runs through the mind while the hands are occupied with something else entirely, present without being attended to directly. She had been thinking about what it would be like to arrive at 58 having spent 22 years being responsible for a large institution. The particular kind of emptiness that would follow that kind of fullness. The silence that comes after decades of purpose and direction and daily demand. She had arrived at something approximately like understanding, but not quite that. More like the outline of understanding beginning to make itself visible to her. Dorothea appeared at the top of Water Street at 7:15 as she did every morning, walking her usual route to the baker's and back again. A gray with amber undertones, reflecting the plaster of the houses, which absorbed and returned the light differently from stone or brick always. She walked the village every afternoon at 3 when the shop was quietest and young Ada Moss could be trusted to manage things alone. Ada was 17 and entirely competent and regarded her responsibility with a seriousness that Frances found both admirable and quietly and genuinely touching. On the 5th of November, she walked down Church Street and saw Dorothea Marsh coming out of the baker's with a wrapped loaf. Their eyes met for a moment, and Dorothea nodded and Frances nodded, and neither stopped, but something had passed between them in that exchange. Some acknowledgement, some recognition that they existed in the same village, and that this existence was not threatening to either one of them. Frances carried this small exchange home with her and thought about it briefly while she made her supper by the kitchen window. The shop was, as Frances had always understood it to be, the place where the village's life came briefly to rest before continuing onward. People did not come to Holt and thread only for wool and thread, though they certainly came for both of those things regularly. They came because the shop had a quality of stillness that was difficult to find elsewhere in the ordinary movement of a daily life. A quality that had nothing to do with the goods it sold and everything to do with the woman who sold and arranged them. Frances had never done anything deliberate to produce this quality. She simply did what she had always done, which was to pay attention. When a person came into the shop, she looked at them, really looked, not the quick assessing look of a shopkeeper calculating a sale. The slower, fuller look of someone genuinely interested in what was standing before her, in what the person was actually carrying inside themselves. "Yes," she said, "that is exactly it." And the exactness seemed to matter to her, the precision of the description arriving where it was needed. After Dorothea left, Frances sat in the back room for a few minutes before returning to the shop, as she did after conversations requiring real attention. She thought about what Dorothea had said about the photograph, about the idea of a place where things could be simple in the right way. She thought about the people who had come to Lavenham over the years with some version of this idea and what the village had given them. Not the simplicity they imagined, usually, which was the absence of difficulty, but the simplicity of clarity, the pattern made visible by time. This was a different kind of simplicity, and it required more of a person, not less, which was something most people did not initially expect. She thought about Dorothea's hands around the teacup, the same gesture Frances herself used, holding the warmth in the palms as well as the throat. People who held their cups in both hands were people who wanted the warmth and were willing to acknowledge wanting it, which was not everyone at all. She thought about the phrase "my husband made a different choice," and the precision of it, and the way it had been said to her and not to others, which was a form of trust, not the trust of intimacy, not yet, but the preliminary trust of one careful person recognizing another careful person. She rose and straightened her dress and went back into the shop where Ada Moss was serving Mrs. Alderton's sister with composed and admirable competence. The shop smelled of wool and lamp oil, and would smoke drifting through the window from some nearby chimney in the cold November afternoon air. The early dark of November was deepening outside, and Frances found it not depressing but useful, a reminder that the day had its own shape. She found in it, as she found it every morning, the particular satisfaction of a world continuing to do what it had always done. The world did not stop for grief, and she had found this, over 11 months, to be a comfort rather than an insult. She put her feet on the cold floor and felt the stone beneath them and breathed, and began the day with quiet resolve. The house on Water Street had been in her mother's family, the Carters, for 4 full generations of unbroken Lavenham habitation. Every surface in it carried the particular character of a place that has been lived in well and consistently for a very long time. The staircase had a smooth patch on the wall at shoulder height, where generations of hands had steadied themselves on the descent. Frances's own hand found this smooth patch every morning before any conscious thought could form or direct it toward the wall. The kitchen was warm and reliable, sheltered from the east wind, anchored by the large iron range her mother had taught her to use. She lit the range with the efficiency of a person who has performed the same careful action 10,000 times or more. Newspaper first, then kindling, then the match held at exactly the angle that always worked with this particular and familiar range. The fire caught and settled into its work, and the kitchen began its slow transformation from cold room to warm inhabited space. While the kettle heated, she stood at the east-facing window and looked out at the dark garden and the bare apple tree. There was nothing to see in the November darkness, but she stood there anyway because standing there was part of the morning. The village outside was waking in the specific way she had learned to hear over 61 years of Lavenham mornings. The church bell, then the crows, then the first cart on the marketplace cobbles, Then old Mrs. Blackwood opening her window. "You never wanted to leave," Dorothea said, and it was not quite a question, more a careful observation offered for consideration or gentle correction. "I wanted other things," Francis said after a moment. "Not to leave. The village was always part of what I was, and leaving would have diminished me." "That sounds sentimental," she added, aware as she said it that it might, to someone who had lived differently, sound like a failure of ambition. "It does not," Dorothea said, and her voice had a particular flatness in saying this, a deliberate removal of any trace of irony or qualification. "It sounds accurate," she said, and Francis understood from the way she said it that accuracy was the thing Dorothea valued above most other qualities. "Will you take tea?" Francis said, and this was not her invariable offer to every person who came into the shop and stood at her counter. She offered it to the people for whom the shop was not only a place to buy wool, and she had a reliable sense of who those people were. Dorothea looked at her for a moment, and then said, "Yes, thank you," and they went together into the small back room behind the shop. The back room served as Francis's workroom and on occasion as a place of conversation for the people she chose to invite into it. The shelves held overflow stock and also the accumulated tools and materials of Francis's own weaving, her most private and consistent daily practice. The loom stood against the east wall, her mother's loom, and before that her grandmother's, maintained with the same careful attention she gave everything. The stove was small but efficient, and it heated the back room to a warmth considerably more intimate than the shop's more restrained temperature. The two women sat beside it with their tea and the particular quality of silence that exists between people not yet quite acquainted but willing. "New people often linger," Mrs. Blackwood continued. "They want to explain themselves, where they have come from, why they are here now. As if anyone has asked," she added with the faintly disapproving tone of someone who had witnessed too much inappropriate lingering over many decades. Frances finished her tea and thanked Mrs. Blackwood and walked back through the November morning to the shop on Water Street alone. Part 5. She passed the bottom of Church Street and looked up it, not deliberately, simply because that was the direction her eyes moved naturally. At the top near the church gate, she saw a tall figure in a dark gray coat walking slowly and looking at everything carefully. Frances did not stop, but she noted the figure and its particular quality of attention and added this to her slow accumulation of observation. November in Lavenham was not a month that announced itself with any particular drama or urgency or deliberate theatrical display of seasonal change. It arrived as it always arrived in Suffolk, with a quiet assumption of authority that needed no announcement to make itself fully felt. The temperature dropped by increments too small to identify on any single day, but sufficient over a week to change the quality of everything. The air, the light, the sound of footsteps on cobblestones, the particular way smoke rose from chimneys and hung in the still cold air. Frances had lived through 61 Novembers in Lavenham, and had come to know November the way you know a person after very long acquaintance. Not through any single defining moment, but through the accumulated weight of many unremarkable encounters, each adding its small increment to deep knowledge. She knew that the light in Lavenham in November was different from the light in any other month and any other November she had seen. It was a warmer gray than the dramatic gray of coastal November or the silvery gray of upland November in other parts of England. She asked what needed to be asked about and did not ask what did not need asking, which required a particular kind of wisdom. She listened, and she allowed silences to exist without filling them with unnecessary words or helpful suggestions or comfortable and deflecting small talk. The result over many years was that people told her things in the shop they did not share with anyone else in their lives. Not secrets usually, not confessions or revelations, but the quieter things, the small worries and the small pleasures they carried daily with them. Frances received these things with the same attention she gave to everything, and they accumulated in her as a kind of deep knowledge. On the 8th of November, a Wednesday, she was measuring cream flannel for Mrs. Thorpe's new nightgowns when the shop bell rang clearly. The door opened to admit a breath of cold November air, and following the cold air, the woman in the gray coat entered. Dorothea Marsh stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the shop with the careful, attentive look Frances had already come to recognize. She looked at the shelves of wool arranged by color in gradations that Frances maintained with the instinctive care of someone for whom color spoke. She looked at the wooden counter with its worn surface and its brass scale and its neat and considered arrangement of small tools. She looked at Frances, and Frances continued measuring the flannel because Mrs. Thorpe was waiting and the flannel genuinely needed to be measured first. Because she had found over many years that the best way to allow people to enter a space was to continue doing what you were doing. "Good morning," Dorothea said, her voice measured and quiet with the careful diction of someone who had spent years speaking to large rooms of people. Dorothy Marsh never came to Lavenham in the autumn of 1887 with her single trunk and her quiet exhaustion. But the light on the timber frames in late afternoon is real, and the church bell carrying across the fields is real. The smell of a wool shop in November, lanolin and old wood, and the faint sweetness of dyed cloth is entirely real. And the way the village looks in its first snowfall, white against pink plaster, so quiet and beautiful, is absolutely real. Frances Holt woke every morning to the sound of the church bell marking the hour in the cold and quiet dark. She did not always know, in those first seconds, whether she had truly been sleeping or simply lying still with closed eyes. Sleep had become a more uncertain thing since Edward died, 11 months ago, on a gray and unremarkable Tuesday morning. Without his slow and steady breathing beside her, the night had lost its anchor, and she drifted through it differently now. The bell struck 6, and she counted every stroke, not because she needed the time, but because counting was an act of presence. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, each stroke placing her firmly in the bedroom on the upper floor of Water Street. She lay in the same bed she had shared with Edward for 38 years and looked up at the low ceiling. The ceiling was old plaster painted many times over many generations, each layer adding to a kind of slow geological history. Outside the small leaded window, the village was beginning its morning in the way it had always begun its morning. She could hear boots on cold stone somewhere below, unhurried footsteps moving through the still and silent November air outside. A cart somewhere near the marketplace, the crows in the churchyard beginning their morning commentary on whatever the morning offered them. Frances listened to all of this with the complete attention that had been her way of living for as long as she remembered. Dorothea spoke first, which Frances had expected without quite knowing she had expected it, because Dorothea was the one who had come to the new place. "I was a headmistress for 22 years, she said. "A school in Islington, girls, 12 to 16, some from good families, most not at all. I was good at it, I think," she said. "The school was better when I left than when I arrived, which is the only real measure of such things." "And why did you leave?" Frances asked, not intrusively, the question arising naturally from the particular shape of what Dorothea had just said to her. "Because I had been doing it for 22 years, Dorothea said, "and I had forgotten in those years how to do anything else at all. And then my husband." She paused, and the pause had the quality of someone choosing words not for effect, but for precision and accuracy above all. "My husband made a different choice about his life," she said, "and I found that the school could no longer serve as a reason not to examine things." Frances did not ask what the different choice had been, understanding from the phrasing that it was the kind that required deliberate and careful indirectness. "So you came to Lavenham," Frances said, and waited in the patient way she always waited when someone was in the process of explaining themselves. "I saw a photograph in a book about Suffolk," Dorothea said, "the marketplace in the snow, and it looked like a place where things could be simple." "It is simple," Frances said, "but not in the way that photographs suggest. Not the simplicity of the absence of difficulty or complication or demand. It is simple in the way that very old things are simple, because they have been reduced over time to what they essentially and most truly are." Dorothea looked at her with a look that was different from the previous ones, more open, less carefully guarded, the look of someone genuinely received. "The village of Lavenham sits quietly in Suffolk, where the land stretches wide and the sky feels endless and calm. It is the kind of place that does not announce itself loudly or with any particular sense of urgency or drama. The fields around it turn from gold to silver to green, depending on the season and the particular quality of light. The houses are timber-framed, built in centuries long past by people who understood wood and time and patience deeply. Their oak beams have twisted slowly over hundreds of years into shapes that no architect could have planned or predicted. The plaster between the beams is painted in shades of pink and cream and a warm ochre that catches afternoon light beautifully. Walking through Lavenham feels like walking through a place that time decided was already perfect and chose not to disturb further. The streets are narrow and uneven, following the land's own logic rather than any surveyor's straight and measured lines. At every corner, there is a new composition of timber and plaster and sky that rewards the patient and attentive eye. The Church of St. Peter and St. Paul stands enormous at the top of the village, visible for miles across flat fields. It was built by wool merchants in the 15th century as a declaration of their faith and their considerable earthly prosperity. It has outlasted both the prosperity and the faith, and stands now patient and vast and entirely and completely itself. This story is set inside this real place, the way a pressed flower is carefully placed inside the pages of a book. The village is real, every street and building exactly where it is described, waiting quietly for anyone who chooses to visit. The characters, however, are not real, though everything around them is as true and solid as the old oak beams themselves. Frances Holt never kept her wool shop on Water Street, but the street itself is there, exactly as it is described here.